War is a tough industry to analyze from the outside, because there are so many moving parts, and we as keyboard warriors only see a small fraction of what is actually going on. But do we have tools that better help us anticipate what will happen? That is the subject of today's Geopolitics Helpline. Was there something that those who understand crisis bargaining could clearly anticipate happening, but was not obvious to the rest of the world? The Russia-Ukraine war comes to mind as an example, but the question applies beyond that. Yes and no. Yes in the way that I think of things, no in the way that the person asking the question was likely thinking. When I am building models, I am not thinking about any specific case in mind. Rather, I am wondering how specific incentives interact with each other, often because they move in conflicting ways, and it is difficult to understand which effect dominates without being rigorous with the modeling. So, for example, I might read about the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam and be inspired to work on a model that will help me understand sabotage operations generally. If it helps me understand what is happening in the news, great. If it takes me in a completely different direction, that is also fine. But the reason that this is a no from the reader's perspective is that we as a discipline are not trying to play Guess Russia's Offer or something like that. Heck, we do not even have the ability to measure that sort of thing. It is easy enough for me to say that war costs for a country can be represented by C and leave it at that. The actual value of C is something that the particular country will appropriately estimate, but that is beyond the scope of a single researcher, or indeed a large team of researchers who do not have access to classified information. And that is a nice segue to the second problem. Often, we as a general public are clueless about which underlying dynamics are driving a war. We get windows to that effect, but states intentionally manipulate the information space, so we should never be confident that we know what we are doing. Nonetheless, the answer to the question is a yes from a different perspective. I am sure others in my industry could come up with their own examples, but I will focus today on 3 distinct times where I have developed a model, and then, after the fact, something happened that was a perfect fit for the model's prediction, to the point that I wish I could have retrospectively gone back and edited the paper that it was published in. Let me explain what I mean. Case number 1, nuclear coercion. In the second chapter of my book on nuclear negotiations, I explain how even if nuclear weapons are only good for stopping an opponent from overthrowing your government, that indirectly allows you to either make tangible battlefield gains or compel your opponent to make concessions at the bargaining table. I do not want to explain that here, though, because I am working on a full video of the idea for the main channel, so hold tight if that sounds interesting to you. In any case, I would guess that I wrote that chapter in 2014. I do not have much in the way of substantive discussion in that chapter. It is just an abstract claim that the math supports. Fast forward to 2022, and I think it perfectly captures what happened with the West's response to Russia's invasion. If you hold fixed everything about the situation, but remove Russia's nuclear weapons, it is hard to imagine Europe sitting out the conflict. I am not just talking about boots on the ground either. With Russian air defenses as bad as they are currently, I would also be looking for European fighters over Moscow. However, all of that is off the table because removing Putin from the Kremlin brings with it a high chance that part of the European landmass gets removed from the map. The case is a perfect illustration of the theory from the chapter, and it would be an auto-include if I ever wrote a remastered version of the book. Moving on, case number 2 is also connected to the Russia-Ukraine war. This time, the project was a paper that I started writing in about 2015. I was spending some time trying to better understand how uncertainty causes war, and I discovered that if you are uncertain about how the other side internalizes its costs of war, then increasing the physical costs of war can raise the probability of fighting. I have discussed this logic before, but the basic idea is that the cost line captures how much the other side cares about the stakes. If you care a ton about the stakes, then 1,000 casualties might look like this to you. But if you care less about the stakes, it might look like this. Note that the difference between the two is negligible, so if you are proposing a settlement, it is generally not worth trying to sort out the truth through aggressive bargaining demands. And all of that is because the physical costs are so small that they are negligible either way that you interpret them. In contrast, if the physical costs of war are 1,000,000 casualties, the difference between a high and low resolved opponent is massive. Now it might be worth trying to drive a harder bargain against the low resolve type, even though it will provoke a war from the high resolve type. Anyway, this is a neat result because it is completely backward from what your initial inclination would be. Remember, I am saying that increasing the costs of war can increase the probability of war. It is the type of logic that a case study would help sort out. My co-author found a good one in the evolution of the India-China relationship. However, this is another situation where if I were granted a do-over, I would switch it to the Russia-Europe relationship prior to the invasion of Ukraine. Many commentators note how puzzling it is that the pair had spent decades developing an economic codependency, only for Russia to throw it away by launching the invasion. But this model explains why. There is good evidence that Russia was uncertain about how much Europe cared about Ukraine. Under those circumstances, greater European costs of war make it more attractive for Russia to make aggressive demands. So the Kremlin greenlit the invasion, expecting Europe to just accept it as a geopolitical reality. Europe did not, though, leading to both the economic decoupling with Russia and enough support to Ukraine to keep the country going for more than 4 years now. To be clear, I cannot say that I knew that the war would happen, and you should not trust anyone who says that they did. The war was predicated on the Kremlin miscalculating, and that is just not something that we have the ability to know will happen when we are sitting behind our keyboards. Not unless you have bugs inside the halls of the Kremlin. And if you do, then you work at the CIA, and I kindly ask that you get back to work. But we can examine situations where the potential for a miscalculation is more likely to trigger a war, and that is what the model did here. Finally, case number 3 goes back to the nuclear realm. Before this book found its way to Cambridge University Press, it was my dissertation. By far, the coolest model in it was one where I showed that increasing the cost of developing nuclear weapons can lead to both sides receiving a larger payoff when the opponent cannot observe whether a potential proliferator has invested in a program. The model is one of the more complicated ones that I have constructed, but the simple intuition is that the opponent sometimes fights preventive wars, even though there was no program in the making. That is the hazard that arises when your intelligence is bad. Fortunately, increasing the cost of weapons makes it cheaper to offer a deal that the potential proliferator can credibly commit to, and it comes at a price that the opponent is willing to pay. The potential proliferator ends up better off because the deal erases the inefficiency of a potential preventive war. Anyway, it was a great model, and maybe the most clever finding that I have ever written even to this day. But it had no case study. Instead, my dissertation used that model to argue that a monitoring problem in Iraq is a bad explanation for the 2003 war, because if a monitoring problem really were at fault, the parties could have done better by resolving the problem as I suggested. I still think that this is an important practical use of modeling, but it is not the type of thing that sells well in peer review. Fast forward a few months, I was starting a postdoc at Stanford, and the job market season was rapidly approaching. I really wanted to use that chapter as the paper that I would present during any upcoming interviews. Consequently, I was sweating out every single day of negotiations between the United States and Iran. Please, just sign a deal. The circumstances are perfect for what my model says. Well, they did sign the deal. It was perfect for my model. I did use it for my interviews, and I think it was important for me getting my current job. Oh, and then the next year, the new president tore the whole thing up. Oh well. Meanwhile, no need for you to tear up because this is the end of the video. Not when you have a whole archive of geopolitics helpline videos in front of you. And if you enjoyed today's video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.